So they asked Jesus, "What is the kingdom of heaven like?" And Jesus said, well, it's like a mustard bush. It starts from the smallest seed, and it grows and it flourishes so that the birds of the air come and nest in its branches. What is the kingdom of heaven like? Well, it's like a small amount of yeast mixed into a huge amount of flour where it makes an all out of proportion impact. The kingdom of heaven is like, well, it's like a treasure that is hidden in a field. And it is so desirable that the man who found it sold all he had so that he could possess that treasure. The kingdom of heaven is like a pearl worth every sacrifice. And, he said, the kingdom of heaven is like a net that is let down in the lake and catches all kinds of fish. And when it is full, the fishermen pull it to shore, and then they all sit down and go through that fish. The good fish they collect into baskets, and the bad fish they just throw away. Now, I'm here to tell you, I personally know absolutely nothing about fishing. Zero. But it's pretty obvious to me that if you're fishing with a net, that you're going to catch up the inedible along with the desirable. And the parable that Jesus speaks here about the kingdom of heaven being like a net refers to a drag net. And a drag net is, as you might gather, dragged along the bottom of the surface of the shore, the part at the bottom under the water. What's that called? That part, you know what I mean. You drag it along the bottom. It's called the bottom. That's why I can't think of the word for the bottom, because it's called the bottom. Yes, okay. So you drag the net along the bottom, and then it catches the fish. It traps them in there, and then you draw the ends together. So that's a drag net. That's the kind of net Jesus is talking about here. The kingdom of heaven catches you up, just like a fish in a net, and it pulls you in. And inside that net, there is an amazing diversity of catch, not just one kind of fish. Reading this always makes me think about being the educational supervisor for student ministers, which I've been doing since, well, shortly after the earth cooled in 1986. And the stories of how people come into ministry are really, really diverse. How Jesus catches them up. How Jesus catches people and pulls them into his net, his orbit, his kingdom. So one man was the son of the manse. He grew up with the example of his father's faithfulness, and he was drawn to the Jesus life and to ministry by his father's example. Another man, he had no faith background at all. He'd never actually been to church. But as a teenager, he was interested in a girl. And he found out that the best way to get close to that girl was by getting interested in the youth group at her church. That was the net that drew him in. One woman was raised in a Christian home, but like so many, she drifted away as a teen. Later, when her high-pressure career in business cost her her marriage and her sobriety, the Jesus net that drew her in was knitted out of a church community that was marked by compassion and by stability and by unquestioning acceptance. The kingdom of heaven is like a net, according to Jesus, a net that is let down into the water and catches all kinds of fish. What kind of fish are you? How did you get caught in the net? Because it's all quite indiscriminate. The net catches all kinds, good and bad, useful and useless, worthy and unworthy. And all the sorting out of what's what is left until the very end. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like, says Jesus. It's like a net. So then we have the scripture passage we heard today, which is another story. This one's a story about Jesus, not a parable of Jesus. A story about Jesus and a net. And this net, in this story, is full of fish. Now, as you're caught by the very end of the reading, this comes, and by the fact that it's very near the end of John's gospel, this story comes from the time after Jesus' death and resurrection. It's the account of one of Jesus' appearances to his disciples. And this story, when Jesus shows up while they're fishing, it is a story that is grounded in failure. It's only a short time after Jesus' death, and the disciples have already kind of given up on this new life of leaving fishing behind and taking up the discipleship business, the discipleship role. They've already decided that, it's kind of a failure, so they go back to their old jobs. They go back to fishing, their old trade. They gave up the discipleship gig. So that's the first failure. And then it turns out not only have they failed at bringing people to know Jesus, they're failing at fishing too. They've caught exactly nothing. So that's number 2 on the failure list. Then Jesus appears on the shore and the disciples fail to recognize him. 3 failures. Count 3. And the next thing that happens in the midst of all that failure is Jesus offers them some advice, but it's really odd advice. He says, fish on the other side of the boat. Throw the net over on the other side. That's like telling a left-handed batter to bat right. That's like talking to the caterer and saying, I want you to serve the desserts first. Fish from the other side of the boat. It's odd. However, on the other hand, what have they got to lose? What have they got to lose? They'd been at it for the duration. They'd caught nothing. So when all else fails, listen to Jesus. And maybe they were recalling his earlier words to them when he said, apart from me, you can do nothing. So they take a chance. They fish on the other side of the boat. They try something new. They experiment with the untried. Now, after all, they say that the definition of insanity is doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results, right? The disciples decide to do this unknown thing. They fish on the other side of the boat. And then, wow, my goodness, they experience astonishing success. It's a full net, 153 fish, and all they had to do was try something different. But man, oh man, trying things differently is hard, isn't it? Oh, disrupting established patterns is so painful. So often we get into a rut and we just stay there because making change is so challenging and sometimes downright scary. Even when the results are poor, we tend to stick with our familiar tactics and our familiar patterns. We keep doing the same thing and expect the results to be different. When Jesus does ask us to fish from the other side of the boat, we resist. We say things like, but we've always done it this way. But we've always done it this way, which are the 7 last words of the dying church. We also say when Jesus says, try this other way, we also say, I don't know how to do it another way. And I'm scared to try anything different. And while doing it this way isn't working, at least I'm familiar with it. So I have an acquaintance, Emmy, who once long ago, and purely out of politeness, Emmy admired her friend Alice's extensive houseplant collection. And from that time on, Alice has given Emmy cuttings, and Alice has grown plants from seedlings for Emmy, and every time Emmy goes away, Alice faithfully comes over to tend the plants. The problem is, Emmy doesn't like houseplants. She thinks they are overprivileged nuisances, demanding of time and attention, that they only create work and offer no pleasure. But what can Emmy do about it now? Let them all die? Who? Tell the truth? No, because change is hard. So Emmy keeps taking Alice's gifts. Emmy keeps fishing out of the same old side of the boat, the way we do, and keeps getting the poor, the 0 results. But how refreshing could it be to do as Jesus says? So, why not try fishing out of the other side of the boat before total failure forces us and propels us into action? Because for the fishermen, the real difference between success and failure is trying to do the job without Jesus and failing, or doing the job with Jesus and succeeding. Because when the disciples do fish out of the other side of the boat, there's this amazing catch. The net is so full of fish, 153 of them, so full that they can't pull the net up over the side of the boat, and instead they have to jump into the water and haul the net onto the shore. Now, this story was remembered and was told, and it got written down and passed down to us over a couple of millennia. That story was remembered because it is a sign. It's an illustration of far more than just a fishing story. This, of course, is the story about being fishers of people. Way back when Peter and his brother Andrew, James and his brother John were called to be the followers of Jesus, what they were called from was their work as fishermen. They were called to new work, to being fishers of men, fishers of people, going out and getting not fish, but a different catch, a new catch, a catch of people who would now enter into a new life in Jesus in the same way that they used to bring in a catch of fish. They're still fishers, but just it's people now. And the net they're using, that net is the mission of the church. The net is the means that God uses to draw all people to himself. Now, back in the 4th century, St. Jerome suggested a charming interpretation of this story. Jerome said that the ancient naturalists held that there were a total of 153 species of fish. So he asked us to look in that net, 153 different kinds of fish, and see that all the races and nationalities of humankind are going to be brought into that net, brought into the life and hope and promise of Jesus Christ. Everybody's in the net. Everyone gets brought in to the new abundant life. And the catch is so huge that they can't bring it up over the side of the boat. They got to haul it in. And the word that's translated as haul here is the same word that John uses to describe the way that people are drawn to Jesus. Now, being drawn to something is a very nice, gentle, polite image, right? Being hauled into something, that's what happens to you at the principal's office. People are hauled into Jesus. They are drawn inexorably. They can't help themselves. They are hauled in, compelled by his message, his presence, his words and deeds. And despite how full of big fish that net is, the net doesn't tear. The net doesn't tear. Now, that's another little detail noted in the story. Even with so many fish, the net is not torn. And that means that the integrity and effectiveness of the net holds despite the great strain. And if we're seeing that net as a symbol for the mission of Christ's church, this is so encouraging. Because we all know, any of us who ever have been part of a church dispute or a church argument, oh, come on, it's not, come on, that's better. That's more like the truth. Any of us who have been part of a church disagreement know that there are a lot of factors that can tear the net that holds the people of God together. A lot of factors that can divide the followers of Christ one from another. We can be divided by language. We can be divided by culture, by nationality, by life experience, or political affiliation, or personal conflicts, or differing views of how to do things. But what this story is saying to us is, take heart. The net is not torn. It holds together. And the fish are brought in, and the harvest of the seas is brought to shore. Now, the word that's used, tear, here, is a translation of the word schisma, from which we get our English words schism and schismatic. Schisma means division or cleft. So this net is not schismed. It is not torn. It is not divided or cleaved, but it is unified. And if 153 big fish can't create a schism or tear in the net, well, then that's pretty heartening, isn't it? All around. The integrity and unity of the people of God is secured by his power in Christ. And that integrity and unity of God's people in the world holds fast despite, sometimes, our best efforts to tear apart, to rend, to cleave, to make schism. Jesus says the kingdom of heaven is like a net that captures us and brings us in, and it is a net that nothing can tear apart. As Jesus said, the community in his name is founded on a rock, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So I want to close today with a little parable about fishing on the other side of the boat, about the strains that can be produced by great success, and how a net can remain strong and whole when we're smart enough to listen to Jesus and fish on the other side of the boat. So my story starts with Jane and Bob. Jane and Bob established a retail store at a prosperous time in a resource town with a lot of good-paying jobs, family wage jobs. Jane herself was from a merchant family. Her sister owned the ladies' store in town. One brother owned the men's store in town. Another brother owned the hardware store. And yet another brother owned the lumber yard. Their merchant family. So Jane and Bob opened their shop, and it really prospered too. It grew, as did their family of 3 sons, Bill, Brian, and Blake. The boys came into the business early, and for decades, a photo hung in the shop of the 3 boys as teens behind the counter serving customers. The business expanded. It grew to 4 locations. Over time, the eldest son, Bill, as an adult, of course, his interest moved from the core retail business to property investment. Strip malls, a car dealership, commercial parks. Brian, the middle brother, had started out teaching school, but within a few years he was back in the family business, and his role was to carefully and gradually take over the original 4 stores from his parents. That's a high-risk, high-skill task, right? He had to take over the running of those 4 stores without edging out his parents in any discernible way. The youngest brother, Blake, he had moved to the nearby city. He'd opened 2 stores under the family name and then quickly 2 more. So in spite of all these changes, the business remained a single commercial entity owned jointly by the parents and the 3 brothers. But cracks emerged. And the net holding the family and the family business together started to fray and actually started to tear. Conflict grew over differing viewpoints on how to run this one unwieldy business. The middle brother, Brian, was made anxious by his older brother, Bill's tolerance for high-risk investing. Blake was operating in a big city market, and he had to start to run his stores more independently. He needed to make his own business decisions about purchasing and marketing and branding. So things were already stretched and a little bit frayed, and then came the flashpoint. Bill's wife and Blake's wife had a big falling out and stopped speaking to each other. And suddenly the net that had held it all together was in danger of bursting open and rending and tearing and even disintegrating. So the 3 brothers decided to fish on the other side of the boat. They discussed it and then participated together in a special program for family businesses run by the commerce faculty of the local university. They got coaching, they got help, and the solution was this: to divide the businesses in order to keep the family together. It took time, it took sacrifice, it took money, but in the end, it saved the businesses and it saved the family. The net has stayed whole and untorn. Now, we get a lot of, we get a lot of information about how wonderful diversity is, right? Diversity is our strength, as the Prime Minister likes to say. Diversity and difference are a wonderful thing, but they can cause no end of problems in a close-knit community like a church. It really is a lot simpler if everybody is the same. I served a church many years ago where everyone in the congregation lived on a dairy farm, all of them but one, Holstein. And the holdout was the guy who had an Ayrshire herd. There was a difference of opinion about things in that church. Can you imagine a church that is that much the same, and yet that what to us looks like an insignificant difference? I mean, a lot of people couldn't tell you a Holstein from an Ayrshire without a field guide, right? It is amazing what will divide us. And when people are all the same, which is an unattainable goal, by the way, it is easier. It's a lot easier if there's only one kind of fish. So Rich Viodas is a pastor in New York City, and his writing really inspires me and nourishes me. He is in a church that is extremely ethnically and culturally diverse. And he says a lot of people look at that and they think, oh, wouldn't that be just heaven? He says they think it's terrific until they try it. It's wonderful. It is wonderful, but it's really, really hard. It's painful and exhausting to have so many different kinds of people from so many different backgrounds. What binds them together is not their diversity. It's only one thing that can hold them together, and that's Jesus. So the encouraging thing is not so much that we're different from each other. That can be a great gift, can also be a great challenge. The encouraging thing, the good news is this: that thanks to the grace and mercy of the one who gathers us, the net does not tear. The non-tearing of the net is not really all that much about us. It is the grace and mercy of the one who gathers us that makes that net so solid, so dependable, so strong. Because of the grace and mercy of the one who gathers us, the net does not tear. The ingathering kingdom of heaven, that net is knitted and strengthened by Christ who is with us. It is the solid rock on which we stand. It is the firm foundation. It is the unassailable promise. Thank goodness it doesn't depend on us. It depends on Jesus. And the ingathering kingdom of heaven net is knitted and strengthened by Christ with us. Thanks be to God. Amen.